The arrival of Grace. La Bastion was a legendary restaurant nestled in the heart of the city, known for its exclusive clientele, exquisite ambience, and most importantly, its relentless pursuit of culinary perfection. On any given evening, celebrities, business tycoons, and food critics sat beneath the glittering chandeliers, eagerly awaiting dishes prepared by none other than the renowned chef Daniel Kingston. For years, Daniel had been the heart and soul of the restaurant, his name synonymous with La Bastion's culinary excellence. But behind the prestigious reputation, the kitchen told a different story, a tale of pressure, fear, and tyranny. Daniel's culinary skills were unparalleled, but his temper was infamous. His reign over the kitchen was marked by a relentless pursuit of perfection, often at the expense of the staff's well-being. He ruled with an iron fist, his booming voice capable of reducing even the most seasoned cooks to trembling messes. Many had quit over the years, unable to endure the verbal abuse and unreasonable expectations. But for those who stayed, a recommendation from Daniel could open doors to the best kitchens in the world. One crisp autumn morning, amidst the clattering of pots and the hiss of searing meat, a new figure appeared in the restaurant's bustling back door. She was a petite woman, dressed simply in slacks and a worn cardigan. Her face was lined with age, her dark skin bearing the marks of years lived fully, and her silver hair framed her face with a quiet dignity. She walked with a calm assuredness that belied her unassuming appearance, carrying herself with an air of grace that made it clear she was no stranger to hard work. Grace Williams, a 68-year-old widow, had taken up a position as a dishwasher at La Bastion. No one in the kitchen had any inkling of her true identity, nor did they suspect that this quiet elderly woman was anything more than what she appeared. Just another new hire, one of many who had come and gone over the years. Grace had been sent here by her son, Marcus Williams, the very owner of La Bastion. Marcus had inherited the restaurant from his father, but left its day-to-day operations to Daniel, trusting him implicitly to maintain the legacy. However, rumors had recently reached Marcus' ears, rumors of a toxic kitchen environment, of staff who lived in fear of Daniel's outbursts, of high turnover rates, and a growing sense of unease among those who worked behind the scenes. Worried that Daniel's behavior might be jeopardizing the reputation of the family business, Marcus had asked his mother to investigate. Grace had been more than willing to help. Though she had never worked in the culinary industry herself, she understood the weight of responsibility that came with running a family business. Marcus' father had been a hard man, but a fair one, and he had built La Bastion on a foundation of respect, both for the craft and for the people who made it possible. Grace was determined to ensure that Marcus upheld that legacy, and if that meant washing dishes in a Michelin-starred kitchen, so be it. As she entered the restaurant for the first time, Grace found herself in awe of its sleek, modern interior. The dining room was all polished wood, soft lighting, and gleaming glassware. But it was the kitchen, the heart of the restaurant, that intrigued her most. It was a place of controlled chaos, with chefs moving in perfect synchrony, knives flashing and pans sizzling. And in the center of it all stood Chef Daniel, his presence as commanding as it was intimidating. Grace had heard stories of Daniel's legendary temper, and it didn't take long for her to witness it firsthand. That very morning, as she stood by the sink, watching and waiting for her first assignment, Daniel exploded at one of the sous chefs. A small mistake in the garnish had set him off, and before long, his voice filled the room as he berated the young cook, belittling her skills and threatening to have her removed from the kitchen. "You call this plating?" he bellowed, holding up a dish with trembling hands. "Are you trying to embarrass me? To embarrass this restaurant? Fix it, or you'll be out on the street." The young chef, barely out of culinary school, nodded frantically, her face pale with fear. Grace watched silently from the dish station, her heart aching for the girl. It reminded her of the stories Marcus had told her when he was younger, of his time working under strict chefs during his apprenticeship. But even the worst of them, Marcus had said, never crossed the line that Daniel seemed to stride over with impunity. As the day went on, Grace quietly observed the dynamics of the kitchen. Daniel barked orders with no regard for the emotional toll his words took on his staff. The sous chefs were tense, the line cooks worked in a frenzy, and even the waitstaff seemed to walk on eggshells, fearful of Daniel's ire. There was an oppressive atmosphere that permeated the entire space, a far cry from the calm professionalism one might expect in such a renowned establishment. Later that afternoon, Thomas, the maitre d', approached Grace with an apologetic smile. He was the first person to speak to her kindly since she arrived. "Mrs. Williams, right?" he asked. "I'm Thomas. I'll be showing you the ropes around here. If you need anything, just let me know." Grace returned the smile. "Thank you, Thomas. I appreciate it." Thomas leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Just a word of advice. Try to stay out of Chef Daniel's way. Well, you've probably seen by now how he is." Grace nodded, though she kept her thoughts to herself. She had seen, indeed, and she was determined to get to the bottom of it. Over the next few days, Grace settled into her role with quiet efficiency. She washed dishes, scrubbed pots, and kept the kitchen spotless. Her age showed in her slower movements, but she was thorough and methodical, never rushing but always keeping up with the demands of the kitchen. Daniel largely ignored her, as he did most of the support staff, but every now and then he would cast a disdainful glance in her direction, muttering under his breath about the old lady slowing things down. It didn't bother Grace. She had faced far worse in her life, and Daniel's arrogance was nothing new to her. What did bother her, however, was the way he treated the rest of the staff. The young cooks were terrified of him, their hands shaking as they prepared each dish, afraid of making the slightest mistake. Even the more experienced chefs walked on eggshells, their eyes darting nervously toward Daniel whenever he passed by. Grace made it a point to be kind to everyone she encountered, offering a smile and a few kind words whenever she could. Slowly but surely, the other staff members began to warm to her. Sarah, one of the waitresses, often stopped by the dish station to chat during slow moments, and a few of the younger cooks even started asking her for advice, drawn to her calm demeanor and motherly presence. But Daniel's behavior continued to worsen. Each day, his outbursts grew more frequent, his insults more cutting. Grace could see the toll it was taking on the staff, their confidence eroding, their spirits dampened. It was clear to her that something needed to change, but she knew she couldn't act too quickly. If she was going to make a difference, she needed to bide her time, to gather more information, to understand the full extent of the problem. As the days turned into weeks, Grace's plan began to take shape. She had already seen enough to know that Daniel's leadership, or lack thereof, was tearing the kitchen apart. But bringing that information to Marcus wouldn't be enough. If they were going to salvage the reputation of La Bastion, they would need more than just complaints from the staff. They would need proof, undeniable evidence of Daniel's toxic behavior, and Grace was determined to get it, no matter how long it took. Shadows in the kitchen. As days turned into weeks, Grace's quiet resilience remained a constant presence in the chaotic world of La Perfection. The kitchen, an arena of culinary excellence, was also a battlefield where emotions ran high, and every mistake could cost someone their career. Chef Daniel, ever the tyrant, ruled with an iron fist, his insults flying as freely as the flames on the stove. But Grace continued, washing dishes with the same diligence, her presence like a quiet river cutting through stone. Despite Daniel's frequent outbursts, Grace managed to forge a few friendships. Sarah, the kind-hearted waitress, had taken to checking in with her, offering small acts of kindness, a cup of coffee, a whispered word of encouragement. Some of the line cooks had also begun to nod in her direction, a quiet acknowledgement of her strength. But they too lived in fear of Daniel's wrath, and no one dared openly stand up for her. One Friday evening, during a particularly busy dinner service, tensions reached a boiling point. The kitchen was a whirlwind of activity, with the sounds of sizzling pans, the clatter of pots, and Daniel's constant barking orders creating an oppressive atmosphere. Every plate had to be flawless, and every second counted. There was no room for error, not when the restaurant was expecting a visit from a highly influential food critic. Grace worked quietly in the corner, her hands deftly scrubbing away the remnants of a complicated fish dish that had been plated and sent out moments before. She glanced up occasionally, observing the fast-paced ballet of the kitchen staff as they moved between stations, all trying to avoid Daniel's line of fire. Suddenly, there was a loud crash. All heads turned as one of the younger sous chefs, a nervous man named Philip, dropped a tray of perfectly seared filet mignons. The beautifully prepared steaks hit the floor with a sickening thud, the sauce splattering across the gleaming tiles. For a moment, there was silence, an eerie, breath-holding pause. Then came the explosion. "Are you out of your mind?" Daniel's voice thundered through the kitchen like a cannon blast. His face twisted in rage, and he stormed toward Philip, eyes blazing. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Philip, wide-eyed and trembling, stammered an apology. I'm sorry, chef. Sorry." Daniel cut him off, his voice rising in pitch. "Sorry doesn't get back those steaks, does it? Sorry doesn't fix this. We've got customers waiting, and you've just ruined their dinner." Philip, visibly shaking, bent down to pick up the fallen steaks, his face pale as a ghost. The rest of the kitchen staff remained silent, eyes downcast, pretending to focus on their tasks, but the tension in the room was palpable. Daniel wasn't done. He stepped closer to Philip, his voice now cold and menacing. "Maybe you should consider a different line of work. Clearly, you're not cut out for this. Maybe you'd do better flipping burgers at a fast food joint." Grace watched from her station, her heart heavy. It was the same scene she had witnessed time and time again. One mistake, and Daniel would tear someone down, humiliating them in front of everyone. She could feel the weight of the fear that permeated the kitchen, like a thick fog that no one could escape. Philippi muttered something under his breath, still trying to salvage the situation, but Daniel's fury only grew. His face flushed with anger, and he took a step closer to the young man, towering over him. It was at that moment that something inside Grace shifted. Enough was enough. Without thinking, she dried her hands on a towel and stepped out from behind her station. The rest of the kitchen was still frozen, watching the scene unfold, and no one noticed as Grace moved quietly toward the center of the room. When she reached Philip and Daniel, she spoke softly, but with a firmness that cut through the tension like a knife. "Chef Daniel." Daniel turned, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Grace. "What do you want?" He snapped. "This doesn't concern you." Grace held his gaze, her voice calm. "It concerns me because I'm part of this kitchen, just like everyone else here." The air in the kitchen seemed to grow even stiller. No one had ever dared to challenge Daniel like this before, especially not a dishwasher. Grace's words hung in the air, and for a moment, Daniel seemed too stunned to respond. Then his eyes hardened. "You're part of this kitchen," he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "You wash dishes. You don't cook. You don't plate. You don't know the first thing about what it takes to run a kitchen like this. So why don't you mind your own business?" Grace met his gaze steadily. "I may wash dishes, chef, but I also understand what it means to be part of a team. A real team lifts each other up. It doesn't tear people down." A murmur rippled through the kitchen as Grace's words sank in. Some of the younger cooks exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of surprise and admiration. Daniel's face reddened. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he hissed. "This kitchen is my responsibility. I'm the one who built this place into what it is. I don't need some old woman telling me how to run things." Grace didn't flinch. She had weathered far worse storms in her life than this man's anger. "I know exactly what I'm talking about, chef. I've been around long enough to understand that fear doesn't inspire greatness. It only creates resentment." For a moment, there was silence. The entire kitchen seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Even Philip, still crouched on the floor, looked up at Grace, his eyes wide with disbelief. Daniel took a step back, his hands clenched into fists. "Get back to work," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "You're lucky I don't fire you on the spot." Grace gave him a small, calm nod and turned to return to her station, but before she could take a step, Daniel's voice rang out again. "But don't think for a second that this is over," he added, his tone cold. "I'll be watching you. One more mistake, and you're out. Understand?" Grace simply nodded, her face serene. She wasn't afraid of Daniel's threats. She had faced far worse in her life. But she could see the fear in the eyes of the other staff, the way they all seemed to shrink in his presence. This was no longer just about washing dishes for her. It was about something much bigger. As the night wore on, the tension in the kitchen gradually subsided, but the mood remained somber. Grace could feel the eyes of the staff on her, and she knew that her actions had stirred something in them. Some of them, like Sarah and Philip, seemed grateful for her intervention, while others were simply stunned that she had stood up to Daniel at all. Later that night, after the last plate had been served and the kitchen had finally quieted, Grace lingered behind to finish cleaning. She could feel the weight of the day's events pressing on her, but she refused to let it shake her resolve. As she scrubbed the last of the pots, Sarah appeared beside her, drying a stack of plates. "I can't believe you did that," she whispered, her voice full of awe. "I've never seen anyone stand up to him like that." Grace smiled softly. "Sometimes you have to speak up when things aren't right, even if it's scary." Sarah nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "But what if he tries to fire you?" "He's vindictive, Grace. He doesn't forget when someone crosses him." Grace set down the pot she was scrubbing and turned to Sarah. "Let me worry about that. I'm not here just for a paycheck. There's more at stake than that." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" Grace hesitated for a moment, then leaned in closer. "Let's just say that I'm here for a reason, Sarah, and it's not just to wash dishes." Before Sarah could ask what she meant, Grace stood up and smiled at her. "Now, get some rest. Tomorrow's another day." As Sarah left, Grace remained behind, her thoughts heavy. The kitchen was still, the only sound the gentle hum of the refrigerators. She knew that her confrontation with Daniel had set something in motion, but she also knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Because Daniel wasn't just a tyrant. He was a man with deep-seated prejudices, and Grace was certain that he would stop at nothing to maintain his control over the kitchen. But what he didn't know was that Grace wasn't just any dishwasher. She was here with a purpose, and she had no intention of letting him destroy the legacy her family had worked so hard to build. As she turned off the lights and left the kitchen, Grace felt a quiet determination settle over her. Change was coming to La Perfection, whether Daniel liked it or not. And she would make sure of it, one dish at a time. A legacy unfolds. The next day at La Perfection started like any other. The early morning light filtered through the tall windows of the kitchen, casting soft shadows on the gleaming countertops. The clattering of pots and pans mingled with the low hum of conversations between the staff as they prepped for the day ahead. But beneath the surface, the tension was still there, lingering from the night before like the remnants of a storm. Grace arrived early, as usual, her worn sneakers padding silently across the polished tile floor. She felt the weight of the stairs on her back as she made her way to her station. Some of the staff shot her quick glances of curiosity. Others whispered in hushed tones as she passed. The showdown between her and Daniel had left its mark on the kitchen, and the staff wasn't sure what to make of the quiet, unassuming dishwasher who had dared to speak out against their tyrant of a chef. But Grace didn't care about the whispers. She had been through enough in her life to know that people would always talk, especially when they didn't understand. Her focus was elsewhere, on the task at hand, and on the plan that was slowly beginning to take shape in her mind. The day progressed without incident, the lunch rush coming and going in a blur of orders, plates, and the constant cacophony of the kitchen. Grace kept her head down, washing dishes with the same quiet efficiency she always did, but her mind was racing. She knew she couldn't afford to sit idly by any longer. Daniel's toxic leadership was slowly eroding the morale of the staff, and if things didn't change soon, the entire restaurant would suffer. But change, she knew, wouldn't come easily. Daniel had built a fortress around himself, a fortress of fear and control. He ruled the kitchen with an iron fist, and anyone who threatened his authority was swiftly crushed. Grace had seen it before in her life, in different places and different forms. Bullies like Daniel thrived on power, and they didn't give it up without a fight. Still, she wasn't afraid. Not of him, not of the consequences. She had faced bigger challenges than this in her time, and she had learned that real strength wasn't about shouting the loudest or wielding the most power. It was about resilience, about knowing when to stand your ground and when to move quietly through the chaos. As the afternoon wore on, Grace's thoughts drifted back to the past, the reason she had come to L'Uplifting in the first place. It wasn't a coincidence that she had chosen this particular restaurant. Far from it. Years ago, before L'Uplifting had risen to fame, it had been a small family-run bistro with a different name and a very different atmosphere. The restaurant had been modest, with checkered tablecloths and a menu full of simple but delicious dishes. It had been a place of warmth, where the food wasn't just prepared. It was crafted with love, with care. And it had been owned by her parents. Grace's parents, Jacques and Camille, had poured their hearts and souls into that little bistro. It was their dream, their legacy, and they had built it from the ground up, nurturing it through years of hard work and sacrifice. For years, the restaurant had been a beloved neighborhood spot, known for its welcoming atmosphere and its mouth-watering dishes, many of which had been passed down through generations of Grace's family. Grace had grown up in that kitchen, her earliest memories filled with the scent of fresh herbs, the sound of laughter, and the constant buzz of activity. Her mother, Camille, had been the heart of the operation, managing the front of the house with grace and charm, while her father, Jacques, had been the soul, creating magic in the kitchen with every dish he prepared. But then, tragedy struck. When Grace was in her early 20s, her parents were involved in a terrible car accident. Her father had died instantly, and her mother, though she survived, was left with injuries that made it impossible for her to continue running the restaurant. Grace had tried to step in, to keep the bistro alive. But the grief was too much. The loss of her father, the sight of her mother's once vibrant spirit dimmed. It was too heavy a burden to bear. Eventually, Grace had been forced to sell the restaurant. It had been the hardest decision of her life. Watching her parents' dreams slip through her fingers, knowing that she couldn't save it, it had broken her heart. The bistro had been sold to a new owner, who had eventually rebranded it as L'Uplifting and transformed it into the upscale, Michelin-starred restaurant it was today. But the soul of the place had been lost in the process. And now, years later, Grace had returned, not as a chef, not as an owner, but as a humble dishwasher. She had come back to see what had become of her family's legacy and to find a way to reclaim what had been lost. She wasn't interested in the fame or the accolades that L'Uplifting now boasted. What she wanted was something much deeper, something more personal. As she stood at the sink, her hands submerged in soapy water, Grace thought about her father. She could almost hear his voice in her ear, gentle but firm, reminding her of the lessons he had taught her all those years ago. The kitchen is like life, Grace. It's not about perfection. It's about passion. It's about doing what you love and doing it well. Everything else is just noise. Her father had believed in people. He had believed in the power of food to bring people together, to create joy, to heal. And he had never tolerated cruelty in his kitchen. He had always treated his staff with respect, knowing that a happy, motivated team was the key to creating something truly special. That was the kind of kitchen Grace wanted to bring back. But first, she had to deal with Daniel. That evening, as the dinner service kicked into full swing, Grace kept a close eye on the staff. She could see the cracks beginning to form, small signs of dissent, of exhaustion, of frustration. Philip, the young sous chef who had dropped the steaks the night before, was moving slower than usual, his confidence clearly shaken. Sarah, usually bubbly and full of energy, seemed more subdued, her smile less bright. The kitchen was running on fumes, held together by fear rather than passion. And then, as if on cue, Daniel's voice rang out across the kitchen. "Where's the garnish for table 12? He barked, his eyes scanning the room. "I need that garnish now." One of the junior chefs, a timid girl named Elodie, rushed to finish plating the dish, her hands trembling slightly as she added the final touches. But in her haste, she fumbled the garnish, sending a sprig of parsley tumbling to the floor. Daniel's eyes narrowed, and in an instant, he was across the kitchen, looming over her like a storm cloud. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice cold and sharp. "Do you think this is a joke? Do you think I'm running a circus here?" Elodie's face flushed, and she stammered an apology, but Daniel wasn't having it. "I don't have time for your incompetence," he snapped. "If you can't handle a simple garnish, maybe you should find another line of work." Grace could feel the anger rising in her chest. This was exactly what she had been waiting for, a moment to step in, to make it clear that this kind of behavior wasn't acceptable. But before she could move, someone else beat her to it. Philip, the sous chef, stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Chef, it was my fault," he said quickly. "I should have checked the plate before it went out. Elodie did everything right." Daniel turned on him, his eyes flashing with anger. "Don't make excuses for her," he growled. "She's a grown woman. She doesn't need you to defend her." But Philip didn't back down. "I'm not making excuses," he said firmly. "I'm taking responsibility. That's what a team does, right? We have each other's backs." For a moment, there was silence in the kitchen. Grace watched as Daniel's face twisted with rage, but there was something else there too, something that looked almost like uncertainty. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by his own staff. And then, without warning, he turned on his heel and stalked out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. The tension in the room broke like a wave, and the staff let out a collective breath. Philip turned to Elodie, offering her a small smile. "You did great," he said quietly. "Don't let him get to you." Elodie nodded, her eyes still wide with shock, but she smiled back at him, grateful for the support. Grace watched the scene unfold, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. Philip had taken the first step. The staff was beginning to stand up for each other, to see that they didn't have to live in fear of Daniel's wrath. The cracks in Daniel's control were starting to show, and Grace knew that this was just the beginning. As the night wore on, Grace continued her work, a quiet smile playing on her lips. Change was coming to Perfection, slowly, steadily, like the tide rolling in. And she was ready for whatever came next. Breaking the silence, the days that followed marked a subtle but undeniable shift in the kitchen of Perfection. The once oppressive atmosphere, thick with tension and dread, began to loosen its grip. The staff, who had grown accustomed to working in fear of Daniel's wrath, were starting to breathe again. Conversations that had once been spoken in whispers now took place more openly. Laughter, though still cautious, began to bubble up between shifts. It was as though the fog that had settled over the restaurant was finally beginning to lift. But Daniel, for all his faults, was not a man who gave up control easily. In the days following his outburst and Philip's quiet defiance, Daniel seemed to withdraw into himself. His temper flared less frequently, but when it did, it was sharp and biting, like the crack of a whip. He no longer screamed across the kitchen or threw pans in fits of rage, but his disapproval was felt in every icy glance, every terse order. He prowled the kitchen like a wounded animal, his anger simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to erupt. Grace, meanwhile, kept to her usual routine, washing dishes and observing the subtle changes in the staff around her. She saw the way Philip had started to command more respect from the younger chefs, stepping into a quiet leadership role that Daniel had never managed to fill. Elodie, The junior chef who had been the target of Daniel's ire was more confident now, her hand steady as she plated dishes with renewed focus. But despite the small victories, Grace knew that this was far from over. Daniel was still a looming presence in the kitchen, and his grip on the staff, though weakened, was not broken. Change had begun, yes, but it was fragile, like a delicate souffle that could collapse at the slightest disturbance. If they were going to truly transform this kitchen, they needed more than quiet defiance. They needed something bigger, something that would force Daniel to confront the consequences of his toxic behavior. And Grace had an idea. It came to her one evening after another long shift. She had stayed behind to finish cleaning up, and as the kitchen emptied out, she found herself alone with Philip. He was wiping down the countertops, his movements slow and deliberate, the weariness of the day etched into his features. Grace watched him for a moment, considering her next move. "Philip," she said finally, breaking the silence. He looked up, surprised to hear her speak. They hadn't exchanged many words since the night of the confrontation with Daniel. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" He nodded, setting down the cloth and leaning against the counter. "Of course." Grace hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin. She had kept her past a secret since she had started working at La Perfection, not wanting to draw attention to herself. But now, it felt like the right time to share her story, at least part of it. "I know things have been tough lately," she said carefully. "And I know it's not easy to stand up to someone like Daniel. But I think there's more we can do. More we should do." Philip frowned slightly, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" Grace took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I haven't told anyone this, but I used to work here, before it became La Perfection." Philip's eyes widened in surprise. "You did?" She nodded. "A long time ago. My parents owned the restaurant before it was sold. Back then, it was a small bistro, nothing like it is now. But my father ran the kitchen, and it was different. It was a place where people loved coming to work, where the food was made with passion, not fear. That's the kind of kitchen I want to bring back." Philip listened intently, his expression softening as she spoke. "So that's why you're here," he said quietly. "You're trying to reclaim what your family built." "Something like that," Grace admitted, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders as she finally said the words out loud. "But I can't do it alone. And I don't want to just go back to the way things were. I want to help this team. I want to create a kitchen where people actually enjoy what they're doing again." Philip was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. Then he nodded, a slow, thoughtful smile spreading across his face. "I want that too," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "But how do we make it happen? Daniel's not going to change overnight." "No, he won't," Grace agreed. "But I think we can make him see that his way isn't the only way, and that he doesn't have the support he thinks he does." Philip raised an eyebrow. "You want us to confront him? All of us?" Grace shook her head. "Not directly. Not yet. What I'm thinking is more subtle, but just as powerful. We need to show him that the staff is united, that we won't tolerate his behavior anymore." Philip's eyes narrowed in thought. "How?" Grace smiled, leaning in closer. "Here's what I'm thinking." The plan began to take shape in the quiet hours after the kitchen closed. It wasn't a mutiny, not exactly. But it was a collective decision, born from the frustrations and exhaustion that had been building for months. Grace and Philip worked carefully, speaking to each member of the kitchen staff in private, gauging their feelings and finding allies where they could. Some were hesitant at first, afraid of what might happen if Daniel found out. But others, like Sarah and Elodie, were eager to take action. Slowly, the staff began to band together, not in rebellion, but in solidarity. It was a quiet revolution, one that Daniel never saw coming. The plan was simple. During the busiest nights of the week, when the pressure was at its peak, the staff would follow Daniel's orders to the letter, but without the frantic energy he thrived on. No more rushing, no more panicked movements or terrified glances. They would work with calm efficiency, speaking to each other with respect and offering help where needed. They would be a team, united in their refusal to give in to Daniel's bullying tactics. And they would do it all with a quiet, unshakable confidence. The first night of the plan felt like walking on a tightrope. The kitchen buzzed with its usual chaos as orders flooded in. But there was a difference, a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the air. The staff moved with purpose, their focus sharp, but their movements controlled. Philip led by example, calmly calling out orders and offering encouragement where needed. Elodie, once timid and unsure, plated her dishes with steady hands. Sarah moved through the kitchen with her usual grace, but this time, there was a lightness to her steps that hadn't been there before. And then there was Grace. She worked in the background, washing dishes as usual, but keeping a close eye on the unfolding scene. Her heart raced with anticipation, waiting for the inevitable moment when Daniel would notice that something was different. It didn't take long. As the night wore on, Daniel's frustration began to build. He barked orders, but the staff responded with calm, measured movements. There were no frantic apologies, no stammering explanations, just quiet competence, and it infuriated him. Faster, he shouted at one point, his voice rising in frustration. We're behind. Pick up the pace. But the staff didn't rush. They didn't panic. They worked with steady hands, their movements deliberate, their focus unwavering. Daniel, watching from his usual spot at the pass, felt the tension in his chest build. He needed to break this strange calm, to shatter the illusion of control that his staff seemed to have developed. He waited until the plates for the large party were nearly finished, their delicate presentations ready to go out to the dining room. And then he struck. Without warning, Daniel slammed his hand down on the counter, sending a loud, echoing crack through the kitchen. The sound startled some of the younger chefs, but they quickly recovered, glancing nervously at Philip. Daniel's face was a mask of barely contained rage, his eyes blazing as he stared down at the dishes in front of him. "What is this?" he barked, his voice dripping with venom. "This is supposed to be perfection. This is what you think is acceptable." Philip looked up from his station, his expression calm but his jaw set. "Everything is prepared to order, Daniel. The food is perfect." Daniel sneered, his hand sweeping over the dishes, sending a carefully plated steak crashing to the floor. "This is garbage. You call this perfect? You're not even trying anymore, any of you." The room went still. The sound of the plate shattering on the tile floor echoed through the kitchen. Everyone's eyes were on Philip. Grace, standing at the back of the room, felt her heart pound in her chest. This was the moment. She had been waiting for this, preparing for this. If Philip backed down now, if he let Daniel get away with this one last outburst, all of their hard work would be for nothing. They would go back to the way things were, with Daniel's tyranny unchecked. But Philip didn't back down. Instead, he stepped forward, wiping his hands on his apron, and looked Daniel straight in the eye. "This isn't about the food, Daniel," he said quietly. "This is about control. You're losing it, and you know it." Daniel's face turned an alarming shade of red, his fists clenching at his sides. "What did you say?" he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. Philip didn't flinch. "You heard me. You don't have control over this kitchen anymore. We don't need your screaming or your temper tantrums to do our jobs. The food speaks for itself. And you're the one who's not trying." A stunned silence filled the room. No one had ever spoken to Daniel like this before. For a moment, it looked like he might explode, his body trembling with barely contained fury. But then, something changed. The fire in his eyes flickered, just for a moment, and was replaced by something else. Fear. He was losing them, and he knew it. But Daniel wasn't one to admit defeat easily. He took a step closer to Philip, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "You think you can run this kitchen without me? You think any of you can survive in this industry without my name behind you?" Philip didn't waver. "We're already surviving. Thriving, even. And it's not because of you. It's despite you. That was the last straw. Daniel, shaking with rage, turned on his heel and stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the room, but no one moved. For a long moment, the kitchen was eerily silent, the staff frozen in place, unsure of what would happen next. Then, slowly, Philip turned to face his team. He took a deep breath and gave them a small, reassuring nod. "We're going to be fine," he said quietly, his voice steady and calm. "We've got this." And with that, the staff slowly returned to their stations. The kitchen buzzed back to life. But this time, there was a new energy in the air. An energy of possibility, of freedom. They had stood up to Daniel, and for the first time, they had won. Grace watched from the back of the kitchen, a small smile tugging at her lips. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The moment the staff had finally realized their own power. But she knew that this wasn't the end. Daniel wasn't the type to disappear quietly. He would be back, and he would come back with a vengeance. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Still, for the first time in a long time, Grace felt hope. The team had proven that they didn't need fear to thrive. They didn't need Daniel. They just needed each other. And as the plates went out to the dining room, flawless and perfect, the kitchen staff knew that something had changed forever. A new dawn. The next morning, the restaurant's kitchen felt like it had been reborn. After the storm that had blown through the night before, there was an odd sense of calm in the air. But it wasn't the tense, nervous calm that usually preceded one of Daniel's tirades. No, this was different. A calm born from the knowledge that they had stood up for themselves and won, if only for a moment. Daniel's temper flared, but there was nothing he could do. The food was going out on time, the dishes were perfect, and the customers were happy. His usual tactics, his anger, his intimidation, had no effect. The staff had stopped reacting to him. By the end of the night, Daniel was a simmering cauldron of rage, pacing the kitchen with clenched fists and tight shoulders. But there was nothing he could say. The staff had done their jobs flawlessly, and he had no grounds to criticize them. The next night, it was the same. And the night after that. Each time, Daniel grew more frustrated, more isolated. The staff continued to work as a team, their quiet defiance growing stronger with each passing shift. And as they did, something remarkable began to happen. The kitchen started to thrive. Without the constant pressure of Daniel's tyranny, the staff became more creative, more efficient. Dishes were prepared with care. And the food that went out to the dining room was better than it had ever been. The customers noticed too, leaving glowing reviews and compliments for the kitchen. And Daniel, he was left on the sidelines, watching as the team he had once controlled with an iron fist began to slip out of his grasp. But Grace knew that this was just the beginning. The real test was still to come. The last straw. Daniel hadn't fully understood what was happening in his kitchen. The subtle shift in the staff's demeanor had thrown him off balance, but he still believed that his authority was intact. For weeks, he had watched them work with a calm efficiency that grated on him, a quiet defiance that he couldn't pin down. His usual tactics weren't working, and it infuriated him. But in his arrogance, he thought it was a passing phase. He believed that with just one good outburst, one well-timed display of dominance, he could crush this little rebellion and bring things back under control. He was wrong. It started on what should have been an ordinary Friday night, the kind of night where the restaurant was packed and the kitchen was under maximum pressure. It was the perfect environment for Daniel's particular brand of leadership. The chaos, the urgency, the heat of the moment where he could wield his authority like a hammer. He thrived in these moments, or at least he used to. But tonight was different. The staff had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Philip had taken to quietly leading by example, offering support and encouragement to the younger chefs, making it clear that they could rely on each other, not just on him. Grace had worked in the background, speaking to her coworkers in private, building up their confidence, reminding them of their worth. Together, they had created a team that no longer feared Daniel. And Daniel, unknowingly, was walking right into their trap. As the first orders of the evening came in, the kitchen snapped into action. The staff moved like a well-oiled machine, their actions precise and coordinated. Elodie worked the grill with a steady hand, flipping steaks with practiced ease. Sarah manned the sauces, her focus intense but her movements relaxed. Even the dishwashing station, where Grace stood, was calm and controlled. There was no panic, no scrambling, just a quiet determination that seemed to blanket the entire kitchen. But for Daniel, it was maddening. He thrived on chaos, on the stress and pressure that he believed brought out the best in his staff. He needed them to be afraid, to feel that they were constantly on the verge of failure, because that's how he had always maintained control. Without it, he felt like he was losing his grip. And then, the moment came. A large party had just been seated in the dining room. Important clients, regulars who expected nothing less than perfection. The kitchen was already busy, and the added pressure of getting their orders out flawlessly would push them to their limits. It was the kind of situation where Daniel would usually step in, barking orders, raising the tension until everyone was on edge, working frantically to meet his impossible standards. But this time, the staff didn't react. As the orders piled up, Philip calmly called them out, directing the kitchen with his usual quiet authority. The chefs responded with the same calm precision they had been practicing for weeks. Elodie plated the steaks with a steady hand. Sarah drizzled sauce over the dishes with meticulous care. Even the waitstaff seemed to pick up on the new energy in the kitchen, moving through the dining room with a quiet confidence that had been absent before. But that victory was fragile. Grace, Philip, and the others knew that Daniel's absence was only temporary. The man who had ruled over them with an iron fist wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. He would return, and when he did, the real test would begin. As the staff trickled into the kitchen, their expressions were cautious but hopeful. Elodie, still processing what had happened the night before, gave a small nod to Grace as she passed by. Sarah, usually quiet and reserved, offered Philip a rare smile. The atmosphere was still tense, but now it was charged with anticipation, not fear. Grace found herself at the heart of this shift. In the weeks leading up to the confrontation, she had been working quietly, encouraging her coworkers to find strength in each other. But now that Daniel had stormed out, she realized that her role had become something more than just a supportive voice. She had become the glue holding them together, the one who would ensure that they didn't fall apart when Daniel inevitably returned. The team's newfound unity was tested almost immediately. By mid-morning, Daniel's presence was once again felt. He didn't enter the kitchen. Instead, his voice could be heard booming from the office upstairs, his tone sharp and angry. He was on the phone, presumably with the restaurant's owner, demanding explanations, making threats, trying to regain the control that had slipped through his fingers the night before. The staff exchanged uneasy glances. Daniel's voice was a reminder that they weren't free yet, that their rebellion, while successful, was far from complete. But this time, instead of retreating into silence or fear, the staff rallied. Philip, who had become a symbol of quiet resistance, took the lead once again. He organized the kitchen as if nothing had changed, calling out orders with the same calm authority he had always shown. The staff followed his lead, their movements precise and focused. They worked not out of fear, but out of pride in their craft, a pride that Daniel had long since tried to smother. By the time the lunch rush began, the kitchen was running like clockwork. Dishes went out to the dining room without a hitch, each plate a testament to the skill and dedication of the team. It was as if they had found a new rhythm, one that didn't depend on Daniel's anger to push them forward. But then, just as the last lunch order was being plated, the door to the kitchen swung open. The room fell silent as Daniel walked in. He was dressed in his usual crisp chef's whites, his face carefully neutral, but there was a dangerous glint in his eyes. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on Philip for a moment longer than necessary before he made his way to the pass. The tension in the air was palpable. No one knew what to expect, whether Daniel would explode, lash out, or try to reassert his dominance. The kitchen staff held their breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. But to everyone's surprise, Daniel said nothing. He simply stood at the pass, watching as the final plates were sent out. His silence was unnerving, a stark contrast to the outbursts they had come to expect. But Philip, ever composed, didn't let it shake him. He continued directing the kitchen as if nothing had changed, though everyone could feel the weight of Daniel's presence pressing down on them. After what felt like an eternity, Daniel finally spoke. "Everything looks good," he said, his voice low but clear. For now, it wasn't a compliment. It was a warning. And with that, he turned and left the kitchen, leaving the staff to wonder what his next move would be. The relief in the room was immediate but short-lived. Daniel hadn't come to reclaim his place at the helm, but his words made it clear that he wasn't giving up. He was biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Grace, who had been watching from her station at the back of the kitchen, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew that this wasn't over. Daniel was playing a long game, and his next move would be calculated, strategic. He would find a way to exploit any weakness in their newfound unity. But Grace wasn't going to let that happen. That evening, after the kitchen had been cleaned and the last of the staff had left for the night, Grace stayed behind. She sat in the empty dining room, her thoughts racing. She had always known that standing up to Daniel wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't anticipated the subtlety of his next move. His silence was more unnerving than his anger, and it made her realize just how dangerous he could be when backed into a corner. She wasn't afraid of Daniel, not anymore, but she was worried about the team. The unity they had built was still fragile, held together by the threads of their shared experiences. It wouldn't take much for Daniel to unravel everything they had worked for, to turn them against each other, to sow doubt and fear once again. Grace knew she needed to act before that happened. The next day, she called a meeting with Philip, Elodie, Sarah, and a few of the other senior staff members. They gathered in the back of the kitchen, their faces serious but determined. Grace wasted no time getting to the point. "We need to be ready," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Daniel's not done. He's going to try to break us, but we can't let him. We have to stick together." Philip nodded in agreement. "He's already trying to undermine us." That silence, that wasn't him backing down. "He's testing us, seeing if we'll slip up." Elodie, usually quiet and reserved, spoke up. "So what do we do? How do we stop him?" Grace looked around the room, taking in the faces of the people who had become more than just coworkers. They were a team now, bound by something stronger than fear. She knew that if they were going to survive, they had to keep building on that foundation. "We outwork him," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We show him that we don't need his approval, his praise, or his anger to be great. We keep doing what we do best, and we do it better than ever." Philip smiled, a rare and genuine expression of pride. "And we don't let him see us falter. Not for a second." The team nodded in agreement. They understood the stakes now. Daniel would be watching, waiting for any sign of weakness, any crack in their resolve. But they wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Over the next few weeks, the kitchen became a place of quiet revolution. The staff worked with a renewed sense of purpose. Each dish they sent out a statement of their defiance. They didn't need Daniel's fear to push them forward. They had found something stronger. And while Daniel continued to lurk in the background, his presence a constant reminder of the threat he posed, the team didn't falter. They were united now, not just in their work, but in their resistance. Grace, watching it all unfold, felt a sense of pride that she hadn't felt in a long time. They had taken the first steps towards something new, something better. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, she knew one thing for sure: they were no longer afraid. and that was something Daniel could never take from them.